I'm Heidi Wong, and this is Twisted Tales. Every week, I'll take you deep into humanity's darkest stories and how they influence some of the world's biggest horror movies. Subscribe if you dare and share your own Twisted Tale below. Today, I'm getting into some of the world's most terrifying serial killers and how they all melded together into the horrors of Hannibal Lecter. Ed Gein's story is all about obsession. Born in 1906 in rural Wisconsin, Gein grew up under the thumb of his abusive, domineering mother, Augusta. She was a religious fanatic who preached constantly about the evils of women and sex. She isolated Ed and his brother on a remote farm, trying to keep them away from the sinful outside world. Ed never had any friends, never really dated, never experienced anything resembling a normal childhood. Augusta didn't hide that she wanted a daughter instead of Ed. She constantly criticized him, told him what to do, and controlled his every move. At the same time, she was the only woman in his life, the only person who showed him any attention at all, even if that attention was abusive. So as Ed grew up, he stayed close to the farm. It was just him, Augusta, Henry, and their father, George. Then in 1940, George died of heart failure. 4 years later, Henry died under mysterious circumstances during a fire on the property. Some suspected Ed might have been involved. Henry had been found with bruises on his head, and Ed brought a search party directly to Henry's body. But the death was ruled an accident. After Henry's death, it was just Ed and Augusta alone together in that isolated farm. And when Augusta died in 1945, something in Ed shattered. He closed off the rooms that she'd used, leaving them exactly as they were, like shrines to her memory. The rest of the house became a mess, but those rooms remained pristine, and Ed Gein retreated into a dark fantasy world. Over the years, he made about 40 nighttime visits to local graveyards. He'd dig up recently buried middle-aged women who resembled his mother, bringing the bodies home and then turning their skin into leather. But the grave robbing wasn't enough. Gein also murdered 2 women who reminded him of Augusta, a bartender named Mary Hogan in 1954 and a hardware store owner, Bernice Warden, in 1957. At the time of Mary's death, no one realized that he was responsible, but on November 16, 1957, police investigating Bernice's disappearance traced her last known contact to Ed Gein. An officer had noticed that the last receipt in Bernice's hardware store was for antifreeze, and Gein had been in the store that morning asking about some. When officers arrived at his farm that evening, the place was dark and seemed abandoned, but they decided to search the property anyway. What they found in a small attached building stopped them cold. It was Bernice Warden's decapitated body hanging from the ceiling by her ankles, gutted like a deer. And the officers searched deeper into the house, and it didn't get any better. There were 9 or 10 human skin masks, a corset made from a female torso, leggings sewn out from skin, skulls used as bowls and decorating bedposts, a belt made of nipples. But that wasn't all. He also created what he called a woman's suit, a literal human skin suit that he could wear. The mom suit, if you will. One of the investigating officers later said he'd never forget the smell, the mixture of decay and the chemicals Gein used to preserve his trophies. Under questioning, Gein confessed to the murders and to robbing graves. When he explained his method, he was calm, almost matter-of-fact. He planned his grave robberies like most people plan a grocery trip. He would choose women from obituaries, then find out where they were buried. After robbing their graves, Gein would come home, dry out the skin, create them into objects, and sometimes even wear his victims as he danced around his farmhouse. Psychiatrists who examined Gein diagnosed him with schizophrenia and determined he was trying to create a female alter ego. Specifically, he was trying to literally become his mother. The woman's suit wasn't just a trophy, it was a transformation, a way to inhabit her skin so he'd never have to be without her. With those findings in mind, the doctors decided that Gein wasn't mentally fit to understand the charges against him or participate in his own defense. So instead of going to trial, he was sent to a hospital for the criminally insane. He spent the next few years in psychiatric care while doctors worked to determine if he could be competent enough for a trial. It wasn't until 1968, over a decade later, that psychiatrists finally determined he was mentally stable enough to understand the legal proceedings. Ultimately, Gein was found not guilty of murder by reason of insanity, but that just meant instead of going to prison, he spent the rest of his life in mental institutions. He stayed there until he died of respiratory failure in 1984 at age 77. The Ed Gein case was understandably a media sensation, showing us the horror of isolation and obsession. But our next subject proves that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they're charming, educated, and sitting right next to you. Ed Gein was a loner, living alone on a farm, avoiding people. But what if the killer wasn't some isolated weirdo? What if he was handsome, educated, and charming? The boy next door. That's where Ted Bundy comes in. At first glance, Bundy seemed totally normal, but dig a little deeper and you start to see the cracks. Born in 1946 in Vermont, his whole childhood was basically a lie. His mom wasn't married, so his grandparents pretended to be his parents and told him his actual mother was just his older sister. He didn't find out the truth until later, just before he moved to Washington State with her when he was around 5 or so. Despite the messy start, Bundy seemed to turn out fine. He went to college, got a degree in psychology, even worked at a suicide prevention hotline, literally talking people out of killing themselves. By the early 1970s, he was in law school with political ambitions. He had girlfriends and a seemingly normal social life. He was charismatic and attractive. If you saw him at a dinner party, you'd say, "What a charming guy." And he used that charm to lure his victims. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy killed at least 30 young women and girls across multiple states: Washington, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, and Florida. The actual number is believed to be much higher, possibly over 100 victims. Bundy's signature move was terrifyingly simple. He'd pretend he was hurt. That's why you never help a man. He'd wear a fake cast on his arm or walk with crutches, then approach young women and ask for help carrying something to his car. People want to help someone who looks like they're in need. It's human nature. And Bundy exploited that instinct over and over again. Everything Bundy did was calculated. To avoid leaving evidence behind, he learned police techniques and what they look for at crime scenes. But most of all, he was obsessed with maintaining a perfect image. And it worked. Even when people reported him to the police for matching a suspect's description, officers dismissed the tips because he didn't fit their profile of what a serial killer should look like. He was too clean-cut, too educated, too respectable, but that image could only get so far. Bundy was finally caught in 1975 when police found burglary tools in his car during a traffic stop, but even then he managed to escape custody twice. The first time he squeezed through a courthouse window, but was caught after a week or so on the run. The second time he pulled off another escape by cutting a hole through a ceiling in his cell, stealing a guard's clothes, and walking out the front door. This time, he made it all the way to Florida before finally being caught for good in 1978. During his trials, the media couldn't get enough of him. Here was a killer who looked so clean-cut he could be running a Senate campaign, not defending himself on murder charges. Before his execution in 1989, Bundy confessed to 30 murders, although investigators believe the true number is far higher. But if Ted Bundy showed us how killers could hide in plain sight, our next subject revealed something even more disturbing. Let's take a terrifying trip into Gary Hidnik's basement. Heidnik was born in 1943, and his childhood was brutal. His dad was physically abusive, and his mother eventually took her own life. On the surface, it looked like Heidnik didn't let his trauma weigh him down. He was financially stable and active in his community. He even started his own church and held services at his house. But the truth was, he'd been in and out of mental institutions for years after being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Then, in late 1986, whatever was keeping him in check just stopped working. Between November 1986 and March 1987, Heidnik kidnapped 6 women in Philadelphia and held them captive in a pit he dug in his basement. This wasn't just confinement, it was systematic, methodical torture. Heidnik chained the women to pipes in the basement. If they acted up, he'd force them into a 4-foot hole filled with water, cover it with a weighted board, then electrocute them by running a current through their chains. He raped them repeatedly, fed them dog food, kept them in complete darkness for days at a time. 2 women died in that basement. Sandra Lindsay starved to death after Hidnik suspended her by her wrists for 3 days as punishment for eating too slowly. Deborah Dudley was electrocuted in the water-filled pit. After Lindsay died, Hidnik dismembered her body, cooked parts of it, and possibly fed it to the surviving captives mixed with dog food. He stored the body parts in his freezer, labeled them as dog food, and kept a severed head in a stock pot on his stove. And the worst part? Someone could have stopped it. Heidnik's neighbors reported a terrible smell coming from the house for months. One neighbor even complained to the police about it. They said it smelled like something was rotting, but nothing ever came of it. Hidnik wasn't caught until one of his captives took matters into her own hands. Josefina Rivera was one of his first victims. He trapped her in November of 1986. Over the months he held her in captivity, Josefina realized survival meant making Hidnik believe that she was his partner. She helped him beat the other women and acted like she supported him, all while she waited for a chance to escape. When Hidnik finally trusted Josefina enough to let her pick up women for him, she went to the police instead and led them back to his house. Diva slay, let's go! This time, they decided to go see for themselves, and what they saw defied belief. 3 women were still alive, chained in the basement. They were starved and traumatized. There were 27 pounds of body parts in the freezer, and there was evidence of torture, murder, and possible cannibalism everywhere. I wouldn't say it's possible. I would say if he tortured and murdered and electrocuted people, he definitely ate them. You know, I feel like he would not draw the line at cannibalism. That's crazy. So why did Hidnik do this? According to his attorney, he wanted to create a baby farm to get the women pregnant and build what he called a perfect race. He was obsessed with the idea of mixing ethnicities, and in his twisted logic, it would eventually lead to world peace. At trial, Heidnik's defense team argued that he was insane. He even dressed in rumpled clothes that made him look crazy. But the jury found him guilty on almost all counts, and he was executed by lethal injection in 1999. We've seen killers motivated by power, delusion, and control, but our next murderer had a different kind of compulsion, one that started in childhood and never ended. Jerry Brudos' crimes revealed how twisted obsession can become. Between 1968 and 1969, Brudos murdered at least 3 women in Oregon, all to satisfy his fetish for women's shoes and clothing. His fixation started when he was only 5. Brudos found a pair of leather high-heel shoes at a dump, and something about them spoke to him. His mom was not exactly open-minded, though. When she found the shoes, she burned them, but that punishment only made Brudos even more interested, and eventually that fetish turned dangerous. By age 17, Brudos was assaulting women by forcing them to strip while he took photos of them. He was arrested and sent to Oregon State Hospital for psychiatric evaluation, and he was actually pretty open about his problems. Brudos even confessed to fantasies about storing women in his freezer. What is it with these men and storing body parts in their freezer? Seems like that would be enough to keep him there for a while, right? Not so much. Brudos was released after less than 9 months. Apparently, he was sane enough for society, and he did seem to be normal enough after that. Brudos got married and had 2 kids. His wife had no idea what was happening in his garage workshop, which she wasn't allowed to enter without announcing herself over an intercom that he'd installed. Not suspicious at all. She had no idea that while his family lived upstairs, Brudos was torturing and murdering women just a few feet away. His first victim was a young encyclopedia saleswoman named Linda Slauson. She knocked on his door in January 1968 when Brudos was 28. He lured her to his basement under the pretense of buying some of her books, knocked her unconscious with a 2x4, then strangled her. Brudos photographed Slauson's body, dressed her in various outfits from his collection, then cut off her left foot. He kept that foot in his freezer, bringing it out to try shoes on it whenever the urge overcame him. His next victims followed a similar pattern. He'd force them to model different lingerie and high heels while he photographed them, then strangle them to death. Afterwards, he dressed the bodies, posed them, and photographed them repeatedly. He kept some of their severed body parts as trophies. He even tried to make plastic molds from severed breasts. Thankfully, their disappearances didn't go unnoticed, and the police arrested Brudos in May 1969 after connecting him to suspicious phone calls made to college dorms. He confessed to everything without much emotion. He talked about needing to, quote, let off steam through killing. He was convicted of 3 murders and sentenced to life in prison, where he died in 2006. Jerry Brudos, Ted Bundy, and Ed Gein are some of the most notorious names in true crime history. There's one more killer we need to talk about, though, whose name you might not know, but that doesn't make him any less terrifying. Let's meet the real Hannibal Lecter. In the early 1960s, Thomas Harris was a 23-year-old journalist working for Argosy magazine. He'd been sent to a prison in Mexico to interview an American inmate named Dykes Askew Simmons, who'd been sentenced to death for a triple murder. But right before Harris got there, Simmons was shot during a prison escape attempt. A doctor at the prison had to perform emergency surgery on him. Harris wanted to meet this guy, and that's when he was introduced to a man he would later call Dr. Salazar. When the two of them sat down, it was Salazar who took the lead. He asked Harris how he felt when he looked at Simmons, if he noticed how disfigured his face was. Harris found himself drawn in. Salazar had this sense of gravity to him. It was almost hypnotic. Afterward, as the warden walked him out, Harris asked how long the doctor had worked at the prison. That comment stopped the warden in his tracks. He told Harris that Dr. Salazar's real name was Alfredo Baya Trevino, and he didn't work for the prison. He was an inmate. Back in 1959, Alfredo was a medical intern and he was dating a man named Jesus Castillo Rangel. One day they got into an argument, possibly about money or that Alfredo was planning to marry a woman. Either way, what happened next was methodical and chilling. Alfredo slit his lover's throat with a scalpel. Then he carefully dismembered the body and fit the pieces into a small box, which he buried on a ranch. But he didn't cover his tracks well enough. Alfredo was caught, convicted, and sentenced to death, although it was later commuted to only 20 years behind bars. But Alfredo's crime isn't what stood out to Thomas Harris the most. It was the man himself. Even though he was in prison, Alfredo had a lot of freedom. He helped take care of the other inmates' medical problems, and he dressed up in a light-colored suit, sunglasses, and a gold Rolex. He also had this calmness to him. He didn't fidget or move around, spoke very deliberately, and had this intense intelligence that was honestly unnerving. And after he was released in the 1980s, that charisma followed him out of prison. Alfredo started practicing medicine again, treating the poor and elderly, usually for free. He wouldn't talk about his past, saying, "I don't want to wake up my ghosts." He lived the rest of his life peacefully before he died in 2009 from prostate cancer at age 77. He was a guy who committed a brutal murder, then spent decades helping people. That contradiction, the sophisticated gentleman who could kill with surgical precision, stuck with Thomas Harris for years, and he used that inspiration to create one of the most chilling horror villains ever. But every great villain needs a good hero, and Harris found some real-world inspiration for that too. In the 1970s, 2 FBI agents named John Douglas and Robert Ressler had a crazy idea. They wanted to create a way to identify suspects based on crime scene evidence, and they thought the best way to do that was to interview dangerous killers in prison, trying to understand what made them tick. Douglas and Ressler sat across from the most notorious killers in American history: Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Ed Kemper, Charles Manson. They talked their childhoods, their fantasies, their methods, how they chose their victims, how they killed, how they disposed of bodies. It was Ressler who actually coined the term serial killer. But if you've seen Mindhunter, this is what the show is based on. Their work was groundbreaking, but it was also really dangerous. During one interview with Ed Kemper, Ressler realized that the guards weren't responding to his buzzer. Kemper, who was 6'9" and 300 pounds, leaned in and said, quote, "If I went apeshit in here, you'd be in a lot of trouble, wouldn't you? I could screw your head off and place it on the table to greet the guard." Ressler stayed calm, finished the interview, and got out of there. But as you can imagine, that moment haunted him. When Douglas and Ressler first started doing this, a lot of cops thought it was complete BS. Profiling seemed like pseudoscience, basically fortune-telling with crime scenes. The idea that you could figure out a killer's age, race, job, and living situation just by looking at how they committed a crime, it sounded ridiculous, but they kept at it. Their research led to profilers sorting killers into two categories: organized and disorganized. Organized killers were smart, methodical, and had their lives together. They planned everything out and didn't leave much behind. Disorganized killers were the opposite: impulsive, sometimes mentally ill, and were less intelligent. Their crime scenes were a mess. This system seemed to work. It helped cops narrow down their suspect list and figure out where to focus their time. But the process was extremely hard on both John Douglas and Robert Ressler. Spending all that time in the heads of the worst killers in history, you can't do that and come out the same person. If you ask them, they probably say it was worth it, because these profiles helped catch killers. Cops who'd been stuck on cases for months, even years, suddenly had fresh leads. Families finally got answers. By the early 1980s, police departments across the country were asking them for help on their toughest cases. The profilers would look at the evidence and point investigators in the right direction. The unit kept growing. They started teaching classes at the FBI Academy and brought in psychologists and criminologists to make their methods even better. All of those prison interviews, they became the foundation for criminal profiling as we know it today. And they caught the attention of Thomas Harris, whose books would eventually become one of the most iconic horror movies ever made, The Silence of the Lambs. So how did all these real-life nightmares come together to create one of the biggest horror movies of all time? It started with that encounter in a Mexican prison with Alfredo Baya Trevino. It stuck with Thomas Harris for years. The stillness, the elegance, the way the doctor would ask a few questions and see right through you. It gave Harris an idea. What if an FBI agent had to team up with a brilliant imprisoned killer to catch another serial killer? What if you had to go into the mind of a monster to stop a monster? To make the concept work, he needed to understand how the FBI actually hunted serial killers. So in the late 1970s, Harris visited the FBI's behavioral science unit at Quantico to learn their methods. The character of Jack Crawford, who recruits FBI trainee Clarice Starling to interview Hannibal Lecter, is based on John Douglas. But Harris still needed a villain for Clarice to hunt. And what would be more terrifying than a combination of some of the world's most sadistic serial killers? From Ed Gein, he took the obsession with creating a woman's suit from human skin. From Ted Bundy, he borrowed the tactic of feigning injury to lure victims. From Gary Hidnik, he used the basement pit where captives were held and tortured. From Jerry Brudos, he incorporated the ritualistic photographing and dressing of victims. It all led to the creation of the killer known as Buffalo Bill. And from Alfredo Baya Trevino, Harris created Hannibal Lecter, the sophisticated killer who could size you up in seconds. Here's how the movie plays out. Clarice Starling is a young FBI trainee who gets pulled into a case involving a serial killer known as Buffalo Bill. He's been kidnapping and murdering young women, skinning them to make a suit of human skin for himself. The FBI believes another killer might have insight into Buffalo Bill's psychology. So they send Clarice to interview Dr. Hannibal Lecter, a brilliant psychiatrist locked up for cannibalism. After they meet, Hannibal agrees to help Clarice, but only if he gets a prison transfer, and she opens up to him about her traumatic childhood. He sees through her, reads her, and manipulates her, all while giving her cryptic clues about Buffalo Bill. Meanwhile, Buffalo Bill has kidnapped another victim, a senator's daughter. The clock is ticking. Using Hannibal's hints and her own investigative skills, Clarice tracks down Buffalo Bill's house. In the film's most terrifying sequence, she descends into his basement, where he cuts the lights and watches her through night vision goggles. Clarice can't see anything, but she hears him cock his gun in the darkness. She fires blindly at the sound and kills him. The movie ends with Hannibal escaping from custody and calling Clarice to congratulate her. He's free, and he's having an old friend for dinner. The Silence of the Lambs swept the Academy Awards, winning Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. It was also the first horror film to win Best Picture. After the movie came out, the popularity of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit skyrocketed. TV shows like The X-Files, Profiler, Millennium, and later Criminal Minds all drew on the film's depiction of profiling. And it wasn't just because of how The Silence of the Lambs captured the actions of serial killers from the past. It was how it strangely predicted the future. The movie came out on February 14, 1991. 5 months later, on July 22nd, the Milwaukee police arrested Jeffrey Dahmer. What they found in Dahmer's apartment was a house of horrors that made Hannibal Lecter and Buffalo Bill seem tame. In Dahmer's bedroom, investigators found a collection of Polaroid photographs of victims in various states of dismemberment. There were severed heads in the refrigerator and the kitchen, skulls on top of the computer, a 57-gallon drum containing bodies decomposing in acid. Dahmer had killed at least 15 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He lured them to his apartment with promises of money or companionship, then drugged and killed them, and sometimes engaged in necrophilia. He dismembered the bodies, sometimes keeping their body parts as trophies, and in some cases, he ate portions of his victims. The timing was surreal. Here was The Silence of the Lambs, with its fictional cannibal psychiatrist dominating the box office. And just as the film was cementing its place in pop culture, America discovered it had a real-life cannibal operating in Milwaukee. The media went into overdrive. Dahmer's arrest became a sensation, with 24-hour news coverage dissecting every detail of his crimes. And inevitably, people drew connections to Hannibal Lecter. It goes to show that monsters can hide anywhere. They can be the local outcast or the friendly guy next door. They can be a successful businessman or happily married with kids. Maybe even the therapist you trust with your darkest secrets. You never know what's hiding behind the door, but you can only find out if you're brave enough to open it. Thanks so much for joining me on this episode of Twisted Tales, a Crime House original. I'd love to hear from you. What did you think about today's story? Anything you're dying for me to cover? Leave a comment or review wherever you're tuning in. And be sure to follow Twisted Tales so we can keep building this community together. I'll be back next week with another unbelievable true story. Until then, stay curious. And remember, there's no reason to fear the dark unless you try to hide from it. If you're brave enough, subscribe now. Just search for @CrimeHouse Studios on YouTube. And remember, reality is the real horror.